Have you ever wondered how far a man can walk into darkness before fear begins to follow him home? Welcome, my friends. I'm John, and tonight we journey into the cold hills of Middle-earth, where forgotten ruins lie buried beneath the white mountains, and old evils whisper under stone. The wind carries strange cries across the plains of Rohan, and somewhere below the earth, something long sealed has begun to stir again. Come closer now, and let the tale begin. Rain drifted across the western plains of Rohan in long grey curtains, whispering over the bent grasses and the dark pools left by old storms. Evening had almost fallen, though a pale strip of cold light still lingered beneath the clouds far to the west, where the sun sank beyond the gap of Rohan. Along a narrow road of churned mud rode a lone horseman, wrapped in a weather-worn cloak, his hood drawn low against the rain. His horse moved steadily despite the long miles already behind them, its flanks steaming faintly in the chill air, and the rider kept one gloved hand near the hilt of the sword beneath his cloak. Travelers were few in those lands during troubled years, and wise men rode watchfully after dark. Aragorn, son of Arathorn, had wandered far from the northern wilds, where his own people guarded the hidden roads, yet the unease he felt here reminded him of darker frontiers beyond the Anduin. The wind carried scents that did not belong upon the open plains: wet ash, old blood, smoke from crude fires hastily quenched. He drew rein beside a shallow stream, where broken reeds leaned black in the water. There, half sunk in mud, he found the print of many feet. Orc feet. Their clawed marks cut deep into the soft earth beside the heavier tread of booted men, though the tracks wandered strangely, crossing over one another in confusion before turning south toward the distant line of hills beneath the white mountains. Aragorn crouched beside them, while rain drummed softly against his shoulders, and his keen grey eyes narrowed as he studied the trail. "Too many for a raiding band," he murmured beneath his breath. "And moving burdened." A dead crow lay nearby, with its neck twisted and its feathers scattered through the mud. He touched it lightly, then rose again with grim silence, for the bird had not long been dead. Whatever had passed this way had done so recently. The road bent eastward toward a small settlement of timber halls and fenced sheep pens crouched against the rising wind. Thin smoke climbed from turf roofs, and yellow firelight flickered behind shuttered windows. Yet no voices greeted the evening, and no dogs barked as Aragorn rode beneath the rough wooden gate. He saw only wary faces peering through cracks in doors before vanishing again into shadow. At last, an old man emerged from a stable carrying a lantern, hooded against the rain. His beard hung thin and white upon his chest, and his bent hands trembled, though not from cold alone. "You ride late, stranger," he said quietly. "No safe roads remain after sunset." Aragorn dismounted slowly and gave the old man a respectful nod. "Then perhaps we share the same enemy," he replied. "I seek news of orcs." The old man's face tightened at once, and he glanced toward the dark hills beyond the village, as though fearful of unseen listeners. "Best not speak loudly of such things," he muttered, leading Aragorn toward the stable. 3 farms emptied in 2 months. Folk gone without trace. We thought wolves at first, though wolves do not carry off iron tools and sacks of grain. Inside the stable, the smell of hay and horse sweat mingled warmly against the damp cold outside. Aragorn removed his cloak, water spilling from its hem onto the straw-covered floor, while the old man fastened the stable doors with care. "The king's riders came north 2 weeks ago," the villager continued in a lower voice. "They found tracks in the hills and followed them. None returned." Aragorn said nothing for a moment, though the words settled heavily in his mind. Riders of Rohan were not easily overcome. A young woman entered, carrying a small kettle of steaming broth, and her eyes widened slightly at the sight of the stranger. She could not have seen more than 20 winters, yet weariness already shadowed her face. "Father says you hunt orcs," she said, after setting the kettle upon a rough table. "If that is true, you are either brave or foolish." Aragorn allowed himself the faintest shadow of a smile as he accepted the bowl she offered. "Often both together," he answered. The woman glanced toward the shuttered stable window, where rain hissed softly outside. "My brother vanished near the foothills 5 nights ago," she said quietly. "He went searching for sheep and never returned. We found blood upon the rocks, but no body." Her voice nearly broke upon the last word, though she mastered herself before tears could come. Aragorn looked into the broth without drinking. He had heard too many such tales across too many lands. Later that night, he sat alone beside the stable hearth while the storm deepened outside. The villagers had long since barred their homes, and silence lay heavily over the settlement, save for the groaning wind and the occasional uneasy stamping of horses nearby. Aragorn spread a rough map upon the table and marked the places the old man had named. Farms taken, missing riders, strange lights glimpsed among the hills. All lay clustered around a forgotten stretch of uplands, where old watchtowers from the days of Gondor once stood, crumbling above hidden valleys. He remembered tales spoken in Rivendell long ago, when Elrond had described the northern reaches of the White Mountains, where ancient storehouses and signal posts had fallen into ruin after the line of Isildur failed in Gondor. Most had long been plundered or collapsed beneath time, yet some places endured after the memory of men faded from them. A sudden knock sounded upon the stable door, sharp enough to bring Aragorn instantly to his feet, with hand upon sword hilt. The old villager entered breathlessly, rain glistening upon his beard. "Come quickly," he whispered. "Someone has returned." Aragorn followed him through narrow, muddy lanes to the edge of the village, where several frightened folk gathered beneath a leaning shed. There upon the ground lay a young rider wrapped in a sodden cloak, stained black with blood. One arm hung twisted beneath him, and deep claw marks raked across his leather jerkin. His horse was gone. The wounded man's eyes fluttered weakly as Aragorn knelt beside him. "Easy now," Aragorn said. "Who did this?" The rider struggled for breath before answering. "Not orcs alone," he rasped. "Men with them. Cruel men." Then terror filled his face. "The pit," he whispered. "God save us from the pit." The gathered villagers exchanged fearful looks, though none spoke. Aragorn leaned closer. "What pit?" he demanded quietly. The rider's lips trembled, and for a moment Aragorn thought the man already dying. "Under the hill," he muttered at last. "Old stones, fires below ground. They drag captives there." His breathing quickened in panic. "I heard them digging in the dark. Heard chains." Aragorn gripped the man's shoulder firmly to steady him. "Where?" he asked again. But before the rider could answer, a terrible shudder passed through his body. Blood bubbled darkly between his lips, and within moments his head sagged lifeless against Aragorn's arm. Around them, the wind moaned through the sheds like distant cries beneath the earth. The villagers soon retreated indoors, unwilling to linger beside death after midnight. Aragorn remained alone beneath the rain, with the dead rider covered in a woolen blanket at his side. His thoughts moved swiftly now, fitting together fragments gathered across many roads, orcs gathering in secret, missing villagers taken alive instead of slain, men serving alongside creatures of Mordor. Such alliances were growing more common in the shadowed years before open war. Yet something about this hunt troubled him more deeply. Orcs did not usually labor long in one hidden place unless commanded by a greater will. He stared toward the distant hills where blackness swallowed the horizon beneath storm clouds. Somewhere beyond them lay the pit the dying man had named. Somewhere beneath ancient stone, something was being sought. Before dawn, he prepared to ride. The old villager met him beside the gate with a bundle of dried meat and hard bread, wrapped in cloth. "You should wait for daylight," the man urged nervously. "No good comes from those hills." Aragorn fastened the bundle to his saddle. "If captives yet live, delay may doom them," he replied. The young woman stood nearby with pale, anxious eyes, clutching a lantern against the cold wind. "If you find my brother," she said softly, "bring him home, dead or living." Aragorn bowed his head once in solemn promise. "If I can." Then he mounted and turned southward into the fading storm, while the village vanished slowly behind him in darkness and rain. Morning crept reluctantly across the plains, cold and colorless beneath ragged clouds. Aragorn rode for hours through empty country, where the grasses gave way to broken stone and rising ground. Ravens circled overhead in uneasy silence, and more than once he glimpsed movement among distant ridges, where black shapes vanished before he could clearly mark them. By noon he reached the foothills at last. There the land changed sharply. Narrow ravines twisted between steep slopes, choked with thorn bushes and dark pines bent by mountain winds. Old ruins appeared from time to time among the rocks. Shattered walls, toppled pillars, fragments of forgotten watchposts built in the strength of Númenor centuries before. Aragorn dismounted beside one such ruin where the tracks he followed disappeared into a narrow defile hidden between cliffs. He crouched beside the earth again, touching fresh marks left by iron-shod boots and dragging chains. Then he heard it. Faint and distant beneath the sighing wind came the echo of a human cry, abruptly cut short. Aragorn rose soundlessly, every sense sharpened at once, and drew his sword from beneath his cloak. The dull grey light slid coldly along the ancient blade. Ahead of him, the ravine descended into darkness between walls of black stone, and from somewhere deep within came the dim flicker of firelight, moving far below the earth. Aragorn moved silently into the ravine, his boots finding careful purchase among wet stones, slick with moss and rainwater. The walls rose steeply on either side, shutting out much of the pale daylight until only a dim grey glow remained above him like the memory of the sky. Water dripped steadily from the rocks, and the air carried a foul smell that thickened as he descended. It was more than orc stench alone. Beneath the odors of filth and smoke lingered the copper scent of blood, and the sour reek of fear left too long in confined places. He paused beside a bend where thorn bushes clung stubbornly to the cliff face, and there he found scraps of torn cloth caught among the branches. One piece bore the faded embroidery of Rohan horsemen. Another looked smaller, perhaps from a villager's tunic. Aragorn's jaw tightened as he tucked them into his belt and continued downward with sword in hand. The ravine narrowed sharply before opening into a hidden valley enclosed on all sides by black stone ridges. Aragorn crouched behind a jagged outcrop and studied the sight below. At the center of the valley stood the ruins of an ancient tower built of dark, weathered stone. Its upper half long collapsed into heaps of broken masonry. Around it sprawled a crude encampment of hide tents, smoking fires and fenced cages fashioned from sharpened stakes. Orcs moved through the camp in snarling groups, some bearing spears while others hauled sacks or crates toward the tower entrance. Yet the dying rider had spoken true. Men walked among them also. Hard-faced outlaws in mismatched armor guarded the outer paths with bows in hand, their cloaks stained by weather and neglect. Aragorn counted nearly 40 figures before stilling his breath, too many for open battle. From somewhere beneath the ruined tower came the hollow clang of iron striking stone. The sound rose steadily through hidden shafts in the earth, followed by muffled shouts and the crack of whips. Aragorn's eyes narrowed. "Digging," he murmured softly. "Still digging." Near the tower entrance stood a broad wooden platform slick with mud, where several prisoners knelt under guard. Their hands were chained, and even at that distance, Aragorn saw how exhausted they were. One old man sagged weakly against the ropes binding his wrists, while a boy beside him struggled simply to remain upright. A thick-set outlaw kicked the old man savagely between the shoulders. "Move, carrion," the man growled. "The pit waits for all who slow the work." The prisoners were dragged toward a dark opening beneath the ruined tower, where torchlight flickered red like the mouth of some buried beast. Aragorn withdrew deeper among the rocks before any watcher could spy him. He knew now the heart of the matter lay underground. But the valley itself presented a deadly obstacle. The cliffs surrounding it were steep and bare, leaving little cover beyond scattered boulders and thorn growth. Worse still, orc sentries prowled constantly along the ridges with sharp eyes suited to darkness and shadow. Aragorn settled beneath a leaning pine tree and considered the camp in grim silence. To enter openly would mean death or capture before he reached the prisoners. Yet to retreat without learning more would condemn those already taken. His hand rested unconsciously upon the hilt of Ondurel's ancient shards, reforged into flame-bright steel. Strength alone would not serve here. Patience would. By late afternoon, the rain had ceased, though low clouds still crawled heavily across the mountain sky. Aragorn circled the hidden valley from above, seeking another path into the ruins, and after long searching, he found signs of one. Near the northern ridge, a narrow crack split the rock face, almost invisibly behind hanging vines and loose stone. Cold air drifted outward, carrying the same foul underground smell, and scattered around the entrance lay old bones, half buried beneath scree. Some belonged to goats or deer, others were plainly human. Aragorn knelt beside them, studying deep tooth marks left upon the ancient white surfaces. Goblins had once used this passage long before the new camp below had been built. He rose slowly and slipped inside the crack with only a small hooded lantern to guide him. The tunnel descended steeply through natural caverns, where black water pooled beneath jagged ceilings. Aragorn moved carefully, one hand against the stone, while the faint lantern light swayed before him. At times, the passage narrowed so tightly that his shoulders brushed damp rock on either side, and more than once he heard distant sounds echoing through unseen chambers farther below, orc voices, the scrape of chains, the dull thunder of picks striking stone. The deeper he traveled, the warmer the air became, touched now by smoke and furnace heat rising from hidden depths. He extinguished the lantern at last, when a faint red glow appeared ahead. Creeping forward soundlessly, Aragorn reached a fissure overlooking a vast underground hall. Ancient pillars carved by forgotten craftsmen supported the chamber, though many had cracked or collapsed beneath the passing centuries. Between them burned smoky torches thrust into iron brackets, casting restless shadows across the cavern walls. Hundreds of tools, crates, and mining timbers littered the floor. Orcs swarmed through the hall, hauling stone and earth from newly opened tunnels, while chained prisoners labored under guard nearby. Some hacked at rubble with bleeding hands. Others staggered beneath baskets filled with dirt and shattered rock. Their faces were hollow with exhaustion, and many bore whip marks across their backs. Aragorn searched quickly among them and saw women as well as men, farmers and shepherds, taken from the surrounding lands. Near the far side of the chamber, a group of Rohirrim riders sat imprisoned behind an iron grate, stripped of weapons but still alive. Then Aragorn's gaze fixed upon the thing the orcs labored to uncover. Beyond the workers stood an enormous stone door, half buried beneath rubble and earth. Its surface was carved with faded Númenórean runes, almost erased by time, though fragments remained visible in the torchlight. 2 black iron rings hung from the center of the door, green with age, yet untouched by rust. Several orcs hammered uselessly at its edges, while others dug beneath the threshold, searching for weakness in the ancient craft. Standing before them all was a tall figure wrapped in dark mail and a heavy fur cloak. He was broader than most men, though there was orc blood in his twisted features and yellowed eyes. A jagged scar split his mouth nearly to the ear. The half-orc chieftain watched the labor silently, one clawed hand resting upon the pommel of a curved sword. "You swore the chamber lay here," snarled one of the outlaws nearby, wiping sweat and grime from his brow. 3 weeks we've dug like slaves." The half-orc turned his terrible gaze upon the man, and even across the cavern, Aragorn saw fear flicker there. "It is here," the chieftain growled in a harsh voice. "Old treasure of Westerness. Weapons forged against the Dark Lord in elder days." He placed one hand upon the stone door with unsettling reverence. The masters in Mordor desire what sleeps beyond. At the mention of Mordor, a cold weight settled in Aragorn's chest. This was no wandering band of raiders driven merely by greed. A darker purpose guided them now, stretching long fingers northward from the shadow in the east. A cry suddenly rose from the prisoners near the excavation. One exhausted captive had collapsed beside his basket and could not rise again. An orc guard strode forward, snarling, and struck the man repeatedly with a whip tipped in iron hooks. The prisoner curled helplessly upon the stone, while the lash tore bloody lines across his shoulders. Rage flashed hot through Aragorn, swift and dangerous, yet he forced himself still. One reckless move now would doom them all. The half-orc chieftain watched the beating with utter indifference before speaking coldly. "Throw the weak ones into the lower pit. The dig must continue." 2 orcs seized the broken prisoner by the arms and dragged him toward a dark shaft beyond the torchlight, where foul vapors drifted upward from unseen depths. Aragorn remained hidden long after the labor ceased for the evening. Gradually the prisoners were herded into barred chambers, while most of the orcs withdrew to the upper camp. Only a handful remained below, guarding the excavation and the captives. Aragorn studied every passage and watchpost carefully, fixing them in memory. At last he retreated through the fissure and back into the dark tunnel beyond. He knew now what lay beneath the hills. Somewhere beyond that sealed stone door rested an ancient armory or hidden storehouse dating back to the wars against Sauron long ago. If such weapons fell into the hands of Mordor, many would die before the coming war ended. Yet another thought troubled him more deeply as he climbed toward the surface. Why had the ancient chamber been sealed so completely that even orcs feared to open it? Night had fully fallen by the time Aragorn emerged once more among the high rocks overlooking the hidden valley. Fires glimmered below like scattered embers in the darkness, and harsh laughter drifted upward from the camp where orcs feasted around spits of roasting meat. Aragorn crouched beneath the cold stars, considering his next move. He could attempt to slip away under cover of darkness and ride for aid, yet the Rohirrim prisoners might not survive another day in the pit. Already he had seen how near many stood to death. No, he would strike first and trust speed over safety. His gaze settled upon the northern cages nearest the tower where the prisoners were held each night. If he could free them quietly, chaos might spread through the camp before the orcs understood what had happened. As midnight approached, the clouds finally broke apart, revealing sharp white stars above the mountains. Aragorn descended silently toward the valley floor through a steep deer path, hidden among thorn bushes and loose stone. Every sound seemed painfully loud beneath the stillness: the scrape of leather, the soft clink of sword fittings. Below him, orc guards wandered lazily between the fires, dulled by drink and false confidence. Aragorn reached the edge of the encampment unseen and slipped behind a row of supply crates stacked beside the ruined tower. Nearby, an outlaw guard sat sharpening a knife while muttering to himself. Aragorn waited until the man glanced away, then moved with deadly speed from the shadows. One hand covered the guard's mouth, while the other struck hard beneath the ear. The outlaw collapsed soundlessly into darkness. Aragorn caught the falling body before it struck the ground. From somewhere deep beneath the tower came a distant scream, echoing upward through the earth. The sound lingered horribly in the night air, before fading into silence once more. Aragorn looked toward the dark stair descending underground, and for the first time since entering the valley, he felt the full weight of the evil hidden there. The pit was not merely a prison. Something worse waited in its depths, something that filled even hardened captives with terror. Yet there was no turning aside now. Drawing a slow breath, Aragorn pulled the unconscious guard into shadow and began moving toward the cages where the prisoners waited in darkness, unaware that help had come at last. The cages stood near the broken base of the ruined tower, where the ground sloped downward toward the underground stair. Thick wooden stakes driven deep into the earth formed crude pens roofed with rusted iron grating, scavenged from older ruins. The smell there was foul beyond bearing. Human sweat, sickness, damp straw, and the lingering odor of fear clung heavily in the cold night air. Aragorn moved silently between stacked barrels and heaps of broken stone until he reached the nearest enclosure. Inside, pale faces stirred uneasily in the darkness at the faint scrape of his boots. A woman clutched two frightened children close against her side, while several exhausted men rose uncertainly from the straw. Aragorn pressed one finger to his lips. "Quiet," he whispered through the bars. "How many guards remain below?" A gaunt prisoner stepped closer, his beard matted with dirt and blood. "Too many," he muttered hoarsely. "And more within the pit." Aragorn studied the lock fastened upon the cage gate. It was thick iron, but old and badly forged. He slid a narrow knife from his belt and worked quickly within the rusted mechanism, while the prisoners watched in tense silence. Nearby, an orc laughed harshly beside one of the fires, and the sound carried unpleasantly through the stillness. Aragorn froze until the noise faded again into drunken muttering. Then the lock gave a soft click. The gate opened inward with barely a groan. Several prisoners immediately surged forward, but Aragorn held up his hand sharply. "Not yet," he warned. "If the camp wakes too soon, none of us leave alive." The gaunt man nodded grimly and forced the others back. "We follow your word," he said. "Only get us out of this cursed place." Aragorn moved from cage to cage with careful speed, opening locks and whispering instructions. Some prisoners could scarcely stand after weeks underground, while others still carried enough strength to fight if armed. Among the captives, he found 3 surviving riders of Rohan imprisoned together behind an iron grate. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a swollen eye and split lip, stared hard at Aragorn through the darkness. "You are no outlaw," he said quietly. "Who are you?" Aragorn cut the chains from the grate without answering directly. "A friend," he replied. "Can you still wield a sword?" The rider managed a grim smile despite his battered condition. "Aye, if my arm holds true." Aragorn handed him a stolen dagger from one of the unconscious guards. "Then tonight it must." The camp remained strangely quiet, though distant sounds drifted upward from beneath the tower, where labor still continued in the hidden chambers below. Aragorn gathered the strongest prisoners behind a crumbling stone wall and spoke swiftly in low tones. "There is a narrow path north of the valley," he said, tracing the route with one gloved finger upon the dirt. "When the alarm rises, take the weak and flee through it. Do not stop for battle unless forced." The Rohirrim rider frowned darkly. "And you?" Aragorn glanced toward the underground stair, where red torchlight flickered against ancient stone. "Many remain below. I will bring them out if I can." Several prisoners exchanged uneasy looks at those words. One old shepherd shook his head slowly. "No man returns from the lower pit," he muttered. "We heard the screams." Aragorn met the old man's fearful gaze steadily. "Then tonight will be the first." Before any further plans could be made, sharp voices suddenly rang out across the camp. Two orcs approached from the southern fires, dragging a struggling captive between them, a young boy no older than 14 winters. His face was bruised and swollen, yet he fought wildly despite the chains cutting into his wrists. "Please," the boy gasped as the orcs hauled him forward. "I can still work." One orc struck him across the mouth with a mailed fist. "The master says the pit," it snarled. "You heard him." Aragorn's hand tightened around his sword hilt beneath the shadows. The prisoners nearby stiffened in horror, knowing exactly what fate awaited below. The orcs passed within only a few yards of Aragorn's hiding place before descending toward the underground stair. For a brief moment, Aragorn wrestled silently with himself. The wiser course was clear. Remain hidden. Wait until the escape began. Preserve the greater number. Yet the sound of the boy's frightened breathing as he was dragged downward cut sharply against every hard lesson the wild had taught him. He remembered too well another frightened child long ago in a burned northern village, slain because help came too late. Aragorn exhaled once through clenched teeth. Then he moved. The first orc died before it could cry out. Aragorn emerged from darkness like a hunting wolf, his blade flashing once across the creature's throat. Black blood sprayed hot against the stones. The second orc spun in shock, fumbling for its spear, but Aragorn drove his shoulder hard into its chest and hurled it against the stair wall. Bone cracked loudly. The orc shrieked in rage and clawed for a knife at its belt, yet Aragorn's sword pierced deep beneath its ribs before the weapon cleared its sheath. The creature collapsed, choking upon its own blood. Aragorn seized the terrified boy by the arm and dragged him quickly into shadow as alarmed shouting erupted from nearby fires. One of the bodies had struck a loose shield upon the ground during the struggle, and the sharp clang now echoed disastrously through the camp. "Go!" Aragorn barked toward the hidden prisoners. Instantly, chaos exploded across the valley. Captives poured from the opened cages, while startled orcs stumbled drunkenly to their feet, shouting curses in the black speech. Arrows hissed through the darkness. One prisoner fell screaming beside the fires, while others rushed toward the northern path, exactly as Aragorn had ordered. The riders of Rohan seized fallen weapons from dead guards and charged into the confusion with fierce cries. Aragorn pushed the rescued boy toward them. "Stay beside the horsemen," he commanded. "Do not look back." Then he turned toward the underground stair as more orcs came racing from the ruined tower entrance. The stair descended in a tight spiral, carved through ancient stone, blackened by centuries of smoke. Aragorn took the steps 2 at a time, while harsh cries echoed above him, and the clash of steel rang through the camp outside. Orcs surged upward from below, carrying spears and hooked blades, but the narrow passage worked against their numbers. Aragorn slew the first with a downward stroke that split helm and skull together. Another lunged wildly from beneath, snarling with yellow fangs bared, and Aragorn drove his boot into its chest, hard enough to send it tumbling backward into the creatures behind it. They fell together in a snarling heap. The ranger pressed downward relentlessly before they could recover, his sword flashing pale in the torchlight. At the base of the stair, the underground hall had erupted into panic. Prisoners shouted from behind iron bars, while orc overseers scrambled to form ranks amid overturned tools and scattered lanterns. Smoke thickened beneath the ancient ceiling as fires spread through abandoned mining timbers. Aragorn cut down an orc, attempting to draw a bow, and kicked aside a fallen spear. "To me!" he shouted toward the captives. "Break the locks!" Several prisoners surged forward immediately, emboldened by his sudden appearance, while others stared in disbelief, as if thinking some warrior spirit out of old songs had descended into the pit itself. The Rohirrim riders above had already driven more men downward through the stair behind Aragorn, and battle now rolled chaotically through the hall among pillars and chains. Then a deep horn sounded from somewhere farther below the earth. The note reverberated through the stone like the roar of some buried beast awakening in darkness. Every orc in the chamber stiffened at once. Even the outlaws exchanged uneasy glances. Aragorn felt the change immediately. The creatures were no longer merely alarmed, they were afraid. From a tunnel beyond the excavation came the heavy tread of many boots, approaching in disciplined rhythm, unlike the disorderly scrambling of common orcs. A harsh voice barked commands in black speech, cold and controlled. The half-orc chieftain emerged moments later, surrounded by towering uruks, clad in black iron mail, his scarred face twisted with fury at the sight before him. "So," the chieftain growled, his yellow eyes fixing upon Aragorn through drifting smoke. "The Northern Ranger comes at last." Aragorn stared back in surprise despite himself. "You know me?" The half-orc's mouth curled into something between a sneer and a grin. "Not by sight, but we were warned a wanderer hunted these hills." "A Dunadan!" He drew his curved sword slowly, and torchlight gleamed red along its cruel edge. "You should have fled while roads still lay open to you." Around him, the uruks advanced in disciplined silence, shields locked tight. Aragorn realized at once these were no common mountain goblins. They had been bred and trained for war by darker masters. The prisoners nearest Aragorn began retreating fearfully before the advancing uruks. Smoke swirled thicker across the chamber now, and sparks drifted upward from burning timbers near the excavation site. Somewhere above, more fighting still echoed faintly from the camp, though the sounds were growing distant. The escape was collapsing. Aragorn could feel it. Too many orcs remained below ground, and the narrow stair trapped the fleeing captives into desperate knots of battle. If the uruks reached the prisoners now, slaughter would follow. Aragorn glanced once toward the half-buried stone door at the far end of the hall. Then a sudden thought struck him with dangerous clarity. He pointed toward the excavation and shouted to the prisoners, "Bring down the supports!" For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one of the Rohirrim understood. "The tunnel!" the rider cried. Immediately, several captives seized mining hammers and swung them into the wooden braces supporting the newly dug passage around the sealed stone door. Timbers cracked sharply. Earth began spilling from the ceiling. The half-orc chieftain roared in sudden rage. "Stop them!" he bellowed. The Uruks surged forward. Aragorn met them head-on amid smoke and falling dust as the underground hall trembled beneath the mountain. The first Uruk crashed against Aragorn's blade with enough force to jar his shoulder, numb to the elbow. Unlike lesser orcs, these warriors did not snarl wildly or break formation in bloodlust. They advanced with grim purpose behind heavy shields rimmed in iron, their dark helms hiding all but narrow slits of yellow eyes. Aragorn gave ground before them slowly, striking whenever a weakness appeared, while behind him, prisoners hammered desperately at the wooden supports around the excavation. Dust streamed constantly from the ceiling now, and the ancient hall groaned deep within the mountain like an old beast waking from uneasy sleep. One Uruk thrust low beneath Aragorn's guard, slicing across his thigh through cloak and leather. Pain flashed hot through his leg, but he answered instantly with a brutal cut beneath the creature's helm that split its throat open to the spine. The hall erupted into chaos. Prisoners stumbled through clouds of smoke, while orcs shrieked conflicting orders across the cavern. Burning timbers collapsed beside the mining pits, scattering sparks and embers among overturned carts filled with rubble. Aragorn ducked beneath a heavy axe swing and drove his shoulder into an Uruk's shield, hard enough to stagger the creature backward into its fellows. "Again!" he shouted toward the captives near the excavation. "Break them all!" The Rohirrim riders swung mining hammers with desperate strength against the support beams. Cracks raced across the overhead stone. Then one of the great timbers snapped with a sound like thunder. Earth and shattered rock burst downward in a choking avalanche that swallowed 3 orcs instantly beneath its weight. For a brief moment, the Uruk line faltered. Aragorn seized the opening at once. He drove forward through drifting dust with terrible speed, Andúril flashing silver-white in the smoky dark. One Uruk fell, clutching its opened belly. Another collapsed with its arm severed at the elbow. The prisoners surged behind Aragorn with stolen spears and tools raised high, no longer fleeing now, but fighting with the fierce hopelessness of men who knew death stood close behind them. The half-orc chieftain watched from beyond the collapsing excavation, fury twisting his scarred face. "Kill the Dunedain!" he roared. "The rest are cattle." More orcs poured from side tunnels in answer, swarming across the chamber floor toward Aragorn's position. A prisoner screamed suddenly from the darkness near the lower shaft. Aragorn turned just in time to see clawed hands seize an old shepherd and drag him shrieking into the black pit beyond the torchlight. The sound ended abruptly with a sickening crunch far below. Several captives recoiled in terror. "Something lives down there," one whispered hoarsely. Aragorn caught only a glimpse into the shaft itself as battle raged around him. It was deeper than he had imagined, a vast vertical chasm disappearing into darkness beneath the mountain roots. Foul vapors drifted upward from unseen depths, carrying the stench of rot and stagnant water. He heard movement below, heavy movement, slow, scraping, hungry. Another tremor shook the cavern violently. Stone cracked overhead with sharp reports, and one of the ancient pillars split along its center from floor to ceiling. The half-buried stone door at the excavation shifted slightly beneath the falling rubble. Aragorn saw it clearly through the smoke. The seal was weakening. Several orcs near the doorway cried out in sudden alarm and backed away from it, despite their chieftain's furious commands. One dropped his pickaxe entirely and fled toward the stair. "Hold your ground!" the half-orc roared, striking the fleeing creature across the face with his sword hilt. Yet fear had already spread among them. Whatever lay beyond the ancient door was known to at least some of the orcs, and they feared it more than death. Aragorn fought his way toward the prisoners nearest the lower tunnels. "This way," he called, gathering them together before panic scattered them completely. Among them he found the young boy rescued above, pale-faced but still clutching a blooded dagger in trembling hands. "The stair is blocked," the boy gasped. "More orcs came down." Aragorn cursed softly beneath his breath. Escape through the tower was failing. Smoke thickened by the moment, and now flames licked greedily across the old mining timbers throughout the chamber. The mountain itself seemed ready to bury them all. Yet one path remained. Aragorn glanced toward the northern fissure through which he himself had entered the caverns. If he could reach it with enough survivors, some might yet escape. The half-orc chieftain saw the movement immediately. "Cut them off," he snarled. 2 Uruks charged through the smoke toward the northern passage, while archers climbed atop piles of rubble near the excavation. Black arrows hissed through the cavern. One struck a Rohirrim rider through the throat. The man collapsed wordlessly beside the burning timbers, while another arrow buried itself deep in Aragorn's shoulder cloak, without piercing flesh. Aragorn seized a fallen shield and shoved the prisoners behind it as they retreated across the hall. Orcs pressed closer from every side now, their snarling voices echoing madly beneath the trembling stone ceiling. The battle had become a slaughterhouse of smoke, blood, and collapsing earth. Then the sealed door burst open. The sound rolled through the cavern like the breaking of a mountain. Ancient stone split apart in a storm of dust and shattered rubble as the weakened excavation collapsed inward completely. Several orcs vanished screaming beneath the falling debris. A blast of cold black air roared outward from the chamber beyond, extinguishing torches throughout half the hall in an instant. Darkness swallowed everything except the scattered fires still burning among the fallen timbers. For a heartbeat, all battle ceased. Men and orcs alike stared toward the ruined doorway in stunned silence. Aragorn felt the cold first, not the honest cold of winter winds or mountain snow, but something older and fouler, a buried darkness untouched by sunlight for forgotten centuries. Shapes moved within the blackness beyond the shattered seal. At first, Aragorn thought they were merely shadows stirred by drifting smoke. Then one stepped into the firelight. It was a man, or had once been. Rusted armor clung to its body in blackened strips, and fragments of a broken helm still covered part of its skull-like face. Yet its flesh had withered long ago into grey, leathery ruin stretched tightly over bone. Empty eye sockets glimmered faintly with a cold, pale light. Behind it came more figures, silent and stiff in their movements, carrying ancient swords crusted dark with age. Dead warriors. Forgotten guardians from the elder days of Gondor, risen now from whatever cursed sleep had bound them behind the sealed chamber. Even the Uruks recoiled in open fear. One loosed a terrified cry and fled toward the stair, only to be seized instantly by the nearest dead warrior. The ancient sword pierced clean through iron mail. The Uruk convulsed once before collapsing lifeless upon the stone. Chaos exploded anew through the cavern. Orcs broke ranks entirely, some fighting, while others fled blindly through smoke and falling debris. The dead warriors advanced without haste or speech, cutting down any living thing that came within reach. Aragorn pulled the prisoners backward toward the northern fissure, while horror rippled through the chamber around him. "Do not engage them!" he shouted. "Move!" But the half-orc chieftain didn't flee. Standing amid drifting smoke and torchlight, he stared toward the opened chamber with fierce hunger burning in his twisted eyes. "The armory," he whispered. "At last." Ignoring the dead warriors advancing through the rubble, he strode directly through the shattered doorway with several Uruks close behind him. Aragorn saw greed overpower fear within the creature. Whatever treasures or weapons Mordor sought lay still deeper inside the ancient vault beyond the dead guardians. For one dangerous instant, Aragorn considered letting the half-orc vanish into darkness and taking the prisoners to safety instead. Yet if weapons from Númenor truly rested there, they could not be allowed to fall into Sauron's servants. A terrible grinding noise echoed overhead. Aragorn looked up sharply. One of the cracked pillars near the northern fissure was beginning to collapse. Stone fragments rained downward through the smoke. The passage out would soon be buried completely. "Go now," Aragorn ordered the prisoners. "Follow the fissure upward, and do not stop." The surviving Rohirrim gathered the weak and wounded immediately, forcing terrified captives toward the narrow tunnel entrance. The young boy hesitated beside Aragorn. "What about you?" he asked, breathlessly. Aragorn stared toward the ruined doorway, where pale-eyed dead moved silently through drifting smoke. Beyond them, deeper darkness waited beneath the mountain. Somewhere within it, the half-orc sought the hidden armory of forgotten kings. Aragorn tightened his grip upon the sword hilt. "I must finish this," he said quietly. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the ancient vault beyond the broken seal, while behind him, the underground hall shook itself slowly toward ruin. The air beyond the shattered seal was bitterly cold and utterly still, untouched by wind or living breath for countless years. Aragorn stepped carefully across broken stone and ancient bones half buried beneath dust, his sword raised before him, while distant battle sounds faded behind thick walls of black rock. The chamber stretched wide beyond the ruined doorway, supported by massive pillars carved in the fashion of Númenor, long before the founding of Gondor. Faded stars and winged crowns were still visible beneath layers of grime upon the stone. Yet age and darkness had not softened the place. It felt watchful. The dead guardians moved silently among the shadows ahead, their rusted armor scraping faintly as they pursued fleeing orcs deeper into the vaults. Pale light glimmered within their empty eye sockets, like cold moonfire trapped beneath ice. Aragorn advanced slowly through the gloom, listening. Somewhere farther ahead, metal clanged against metal, followed by the harsh bark of orc voices and the sudden screams of dying creatures. The half-orc chieftain was still alive. Aragorn passed beneath a cracked archway, where ancient braziers stood black and empty along the walls. Here and there lay remnants of the old defenders who had sealed this place ages before. Broken shields, dust-covered helms, skeletons collapsed beside rusted swords, still clutched in lifeless hands. He knelt briefly beside one such figure, wearing fragments of a Gondorian captain's cloak. Upon the floor near its hand lay a corroded iron seal, bearing the white tree beneath 7 stars. Aragorn touched it lightly, and sorrow stirred within him like an old wound. These men had died guarding something they deemed too dangerous to leave unsealed. A low growl echoed suddenly through the corridor ahead. Aragorn flattened himself against a pillar, just as 2 Uruks stumbled around the corner, carrying a heavy iron chest between them. Both creatures were bleeding badly, their black mail torn by sword cuts left from the dead guardians. "Move," one snarled breathlessly. "The dead come behind." The other glanced back with naked terror in its eyes. The master should never have opened this place. Aragorn waited until they passed beside him through the shadows. Then he struck swiftly. Andúril flashed once, shearing through the nearer Uruk's neck. Before the second could shout, Aragorn drove his blade beneath its ribs and forced the creature hard against the wall. The iron chest crashed heavily to the floor. Aragorn listened for alarm, but heard only distant echoes deeper within the vault. He knelt beside the fallen chest and pried its lid open cautiously. Inside rested bundles of blackened spearheads, ancient but finely wrought, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived the centuries. Beneath them lay several short swords bearing the star mark of Westernesse upon their hilts. Aragorn lifted one carefully. Though dulled by age, the blade remained straight and strong. No wonder Mordor coveted this hidden armory. Weapons forged by Númenórean smiths were deadly against the servants of the Shadow, even after long years. Yet the chamber held no treasure of gold or jewels. This had been a war storehouse, sealed during some forgotten siege and abandoned to darkness when its defenders perished. Aragorn replaced the sword slowly. If Sauron armed his growing hosts with such weapons, blood would drown the western lands before the end. The corridor widened into a great hall, lined with statues, whose faces had long crumbled away. Here the fighting had become savage. Dead Uruks lay scattered across the floor beside shattered skeletons and broken ancient blades. Black blood stained the dusty stones. One of the dead guardians knelt motionless against a pillar, with half its skull split apart by axe blows, pale light flickering weakly within its ruined head. Yet others still hunted through the darkness with tireless patience. Aragorn moved carefully among the corpses until he heard voices ahead. Harsh whispers, angry, desperate. He extinguished the torch taken from the outer chamber and slipped forward beneath the cover of darkness. The half-orc chieftain stood within a circular armory chamber, lit by two flickering lanterns hastily hung upon iron hooks. Around him, several surviving Uruks stuffed weapons into sacks, while others struggled to force open old wooden crates bound in rusted iron. The chieftain himself knelt before a stone pedestal at the center of the room. Upon it rested a long sword sheathed in black leather, untouched by decay. Unlike the other weapons, this one gleamed faintly even beneath layers of dust. Runes shimmered along the silver pommel. Aragorn felt unease tighten within him immediately. There was power in that blade, old and dangerous. The half-orc reached toward it almost reverently. "Do not touch it," Aragorn said from the darkness. Every head snapped toward him at once. The Uruks roared and seized their weapons, while the half-orc rose slowly from beside the pedestal, his yellow eyes narrowing beneath the lantern light. "You followed," he growled. Foolish even for a Dunedain. Aragorn stepped fully into the chamber, sword ready. "Leave these halls," he said coldly. "Take your creatures and go. This place was buried for good reason." The half-orc barked a harsh laugh. "Reason?" He gestured wildly toward the surrounding crates and weapon racks. "Look around you. The kings of men hid strength here, while their realms crumbled into dust." His scarred mouth twisted with contempt. "And now Mordor rises, while Gondor rots behind stone walls." Aragorn's gaze hardened. "Mordor will fall again." The half-orc's eyes burned with sudden hatred. "You speak as if you are already king." Then he drew the black-sheathed sword from the pedestal. The chamber darkened instantly. A cold wave swept outward from the unsheathed blade, extinguishing one of the lanterns and sending the remaining flame guttering wildly. The sword itself was long and narrow, forged of dark steel that reflected no light. Faint runes crawled along its edge like moving shadows. One of the Uruks nearest the chieftain recoiled uneasily upon seeing it. "Master," the creature muttered, "that blade is cursed." The half-orc ignored him. He lifted the weapon slowly, and a terrible smile spread across his scarred face. "No," he whispered. "It is hungry." Aragorn felt the evil in the sword at once. This was no noble weapon of Númenor. Somehow it had been sealed away among the armory long ago, hidden rather than preserved. He understood then why the ancient guardians had remained behind locked doors for centuries. They had not merely defended the armory, they had imprisoned something within it. A faint scraping sound echoed from the dark corridor behind Aragorn. The dead guardians were approaching. The Uruks heard it too. Fear spread immediately among them, despite the chieftain's furious glare. "Hold your ground," he snarled. "Take the weapons and move." Yet before the creatures could obey, pale shapes emerged silently through the chamber entrance. The dead warriors advanced without haste, ancient swords raised, their empty eyes fixed upon the black blade now clutched in the half-orc's hand. One of the Uruks broke completely and fled shrieking toward the far passage. A dead guardian intercepted it with terrible swiftness, cutting the creature down in a spray of black blood. Then the chamber exploded into violence. Aragorn met the first charging Uruk beside the weapon racks, steel ringing sharply in the cold air. The creature fought savagely despite its terror, hammering heavy blows against Aragorn's guard, while dead warriors closed from behind. Another Uruk lunged with a spear from Aragorn's blind side, but a dead guardian seized the shaft abruptly and snapped it in half before driving its rusted sword through the creature's chest. Everywhere the pale-eyed dead cut through orcs and Uruks alike with relentless silence. Yet the half-orc chieftain didn't retreat. He strode straight toward Aragorn through the chaos with the black sword raised high. Their blades met with a crash that echoed through the chamber. Aragorn felt a shock of icy pain race up his arm the instant the cursed blade touched Andúril. The half-orc struck again with brutal strength, forcing Aragorn backward across the stone floor. "Do you feel it?" the chieftain hissed between blows. "The old darkness remembers." Aragorn parried another savage strike and saw black frost spreading slowly across the edge of his own blade where the cursed sword had touched it. The half-orc laughed harshly. "Even your precious western steel fears this weapon." Aragorn said nothing. He had fought ringwraiths before and knew something of weapons steeped in dark sorcery. This blade fed not merely upon flesh, but upon fear itself. The chamber trembled violently. Cracks split the ceiling overhead as the mountain continued collapsing around the ancient vaults. Dust poured downward in choking streams. One of the weapon racks toppled with a thunderous crash, while dead warriors and Uruks battled blindly through drifting stone debris. Aragorn barely avoided a falling block large enough to crush a horse. The half-orc pressed the attack relentlessly, his eyes burning with madness now as the cursed sword hissed through the air. "You cannot stop what comes," he growled. "The Dark Lord gathers strength while your people hide in ruins and forests." Aragorn blocked another blow hard enough to drive him to one knee. "The strength of men is not ended," he answered grimly. Then the black sword whispered. The sound slithered through the chamber, like a breath against Aragorn's ear, though the half-orc's lips never moved. Dark visions flickered suddenly at the edge of Aragorn's sight. Burning cities, endless armies beneath red banners, the white tree fallen and blackened beneath storm clouds. He saw himself standing alone, amid ruin with crownless kings dead around him. For a heartbeat, the despair struck deep and cold. The sword fed upon weakness, upon doubt. The half-orc saw hesitation flicker across Aragorn's face and grinned savagely. "Yes," he murmured. "Now you see." But Aragorn had walked long roads beneath shadow and fear before this night. He remembered the wisdom of Elrond, the steadfast courage of the Dúnedain, and the countless weary faces of ordinary folk, still trusting that darkness could be resisted. With a harsh cry, he surged upward suddenly, driving the half-orc backward with unexpected force. Andúril blazed silver in the lantern light, as if answering his will. The half-orc stumbled against the stone pedestal in shock. At that same instant, a massive crack split the chamber ceiling directly above them. Stone burst downward in a roaring avalanche. Aragorn leapt aside as the roof collapsed between them in thunder and dust, hurling both men and monsters sprawling into darkness. The collapse struck the chamber like the wrath of the mountain itself. Stone shattered downward through clouds of dust, thick enough to blind, crushing weapon racks and ancient pillars beneath its weight. Aragorn hit the ground hard beside the broken pedestal, the breath driven violently from his chest as debris hammered across the floor around him. For several moments there was only roaring darkness, filled with grinding rock and screaming echoes. Then silence crept slowly back into the ruined vault, broken only by distant groans from the shifting mountain overhead. Aragorn forced himself upright through the haze, coughing against the choking dust that coated his mouth and throat like ash. Blood trickled warmly from a cut above his brow into one eye. His sword still remained in his grasp. The chamber had become a tomb of broken stone. Half the ceiling had collapsed entirely, burying much of the armory beneath, jagged slabs and splintered beams. Fires burned weakly among the rubble where shattered lantern oil had spread across the floor. Aragorn moved carefully through drifting dust, searching for movement. Several dead guardians lay crushed beneath fallen pillars, their pale lights extinguished at last. Nearby, the body of an Uruk protruded from beneath a massive block of stone, twisted beyond recognition. Yet the black sword was gone. Aragorn's gaze swept quickly across the wreckage until he saw a narrow opening torn through the far wall, where the collapse had broken into some older, hidden passage. Fresh blood stained the stones leading toward it. The half-orc had escaped. A low rumble echoed again through the depths. Aragorn looked upward sharply as more dust sifted from the cracked ceiling. The entire mountain was failing now. If the deeper vaults collapsed completely, every survivor still within the tunnels would perish. He thought briefly of the fleeing prisoners and hoped the northern fissure had remained open long enough for them to escape. Yet the black sword could not be allowed to leave these ruins. Already Aragorn had felt its poison working upon the mind. In the hands of a servant of Mordor, it would spread death far beyond these hills. Tightening his grip upon Andúril, he stepped through the broken opening into darkness. Newo! The hidden passage beyond sloped steeply downward through rough-hewn stone, unlike the crafted halls above. Here there were no carvings or pillars of Númenor. The walls seemed older, cruder, perhaps natural caverns widened long ago by forgotten hands. Cold water dripped steadily from the ceiling, gathering in black pools beneath Aragorn's boots. The air smelled foul and stagnant. Ahead, faint torchlight flickered weakly around distant bends in the tunnel, accompanied by hurried footsteps scraping across stone. Aragorn followed at once, though pain throbbed now through his wounded thigh and shoulders with every stride. The mountain groaned constantly around him. Somewhere behind, entire chambers were collapsing into ruin. The tunnel widened suddenly into a cavern so vast that Aragorn could not see its far walls clearly through the gloom. A dark underground lake stretched before him, motionless as black glass beneath the faint glow of scattered phosphorescent moss clinging to the rocks. Ancient wooden walkways crossed portions of the cavern, though many had long since rotted into the water below. Aragorn halted beside the shore, listening. The silence here felt wrong, oppressive. Then, faintly across the cavern, he heard the harsh voice of the half-orc, echoing among the stone vaults. "Move!" the creature snarled. "The eastern passage lies ahead." Aragorn crouched lower behind a jagged rock outcrop and peered through the darkness. Across the cavern, he glimpsed several surviving Uruks, carrying sacks of weapons along a narrow causeway near the lake's edge. The half-orc strode beside them, clutching the black sword wrapped once more within its sheath. Even from this distance, Aragorn sensed the malign presence of the thing like a wound in the air. One Uruk limped badly with blood streaming down its leg. Another glanced repeatedly back toward the darkness behind them. The dead still follow, it muttered fearfully. The half-orc rounded on the creature with sudden fury. Then let them drown in falling stone. We leave now. A soft ripple disturbed the lake surface nearby. Aragorn's eyes narrowed. Something moved beneath the black water. Slowly, deliberately. He remained perfectly still, while another ripple spread outward through the darkness farther from shore. The Uruks had not noticed. Their attention remained fixed upon the eastern tunnels ahead. Aragorn drew a slow breath. Whatever dwelt beneath the lake had likely fed for years upon creatures thrown into the lower pit above. He remembered the old shepherd dragged screaming into darkness, the foul smell rising from the shaft. This cavern lay directly beneath that abyss, a feeding ground. The realization came coldly. The orcs had not merely used the lower pit for executions, they had used it to keep something fed. One of the Uruks carrying a sack suddenly stumbled upon the slick causeway stones. The bundle burst open as it struck the ground, scattering ancient Númenórean blades across the walkway with loud metallic clatter. The creature cursed and bent hurriedly to gather them. Then the lake erupted. A massive shape surged upward from the black water in an explosion of foam and spray. Long, pale limbs covered in slick grey flesh wrapped instantly around the screaming Uruk. Aragorn caught only fragments through the chaos. Huge, lidless eyes, rows of jagged teeth, a body swollen and malformed from endless darkness below the earth. The creature dragged the Uruk shrieking into the lake before the others could even react. Black water churned violently. Then silence returned, as if nothing had disturbed the cavern at all. Panic seized the remaining Uruks immediately. "Run!" one bellowed, abandoning the weapon sacks entirely. The half-orc cursed furiously and struck the fleeing creature across the back with the sheathed sword. "Cowards!" Yet even he backed away from the water now, eyes darting across the dark surface uneasily. Aragorn saw his chance. Moving swiftly along the rocks beside the shore, he closed the distance through shadow, while the surviving Uruks clustered together in fear. The mountain trembled again overhead. Stones splashed into the lake from unseen heights, sending fresh ripples spreading across the black water. Then one of the Uruks saw Aragorn. The creature shouted a warning too late. Aragorn burst from behind the rocks, with Anduril blazing pale in the cavern gloom. The nearest Uruk fell instantly beneath a downward stroke that split helm and skull apart. Another lunged wildly with a spear, but Aragorn turned the thrust aside and drove his sword through the creature's chest. The remaining Uruks broke in terror between Aragorn behind them and the dark water beside them. One leapt desperately onto a crumbling wooden walkway extending across the cavern. The ancient boards collapsed beneath its weight at once. The creature vanished screaming into the lake below. A heartbeat later, the water boiled red. The half-orc roared and drew the black sword again. Darkness seemed to thicken around the blade as it left the sheath. Aragorn felt cold weakness claw instantly at his thoughts, but this time he resisted it fiercely. The half-orc charged with savage strength, driving Aragorn backward along the narrow causeway beside the lake. Their blades crashed together amid flying sparks, while black water surged only feet away beside them. "You should have died above." The half-orc snarled, striking again and again with relentless fury. Aragorn parried carefully, watching the slick stones beneath his boots. One misstep would send either of them plunging into the depths. The black sword whispered once more, but louder now. Aragorn heard voices within it, not clear words, but fragments woven from fear and memory. He saw the faces of dead companions from distant yores, rangers slain defending lonely northern roads, villages burned despite all his efforts to protect them. The voice twisted every old failure into poison. The half-orc grinned savagely as Aragorn faltered for half a heartbeat beneath the assault. "It knows you," the creature hissed. "It drinks your weakness." Aragorn's boot slid dangerously close to the water's edge as another blow crashed against Andúril. Behind the half-orc, the lake rippled once more. Then Aragorn understood. The creature beneath the water was drawn not merely by movement or blood. It came toward fear, toward panic and death. The cursed sword had filled the cavern with both. Aragorn suddenly gave ground on purpose, retreating farther along the narrow causeway toward deeper water. The half-orc pressed after him eagerly, sensing victory close at hand. "Fall, Dunedain!" the creature roared. "Fall into darkness with your broken kingdoms!" Aragorn parried another heavy strike and stumbled deliberately to one knee near the very edge of the lake. The half-orc raised the black blade high for the killing blow. The water exploded upward behind him. A monstrous pale limb, thicker than a tree trunk, coiled around the half-orc's torso with terrifying speed. The creature screamed in shock and fury as jagged claws tightened through black mail and flesh alike. Aragorn hurled himself backward, just as the half-orc was dragged violently toward the lake. Yet even then, the creature did not release the cursed sword. Clinging desperately to the weapon, the half-orc slashed wildly at the monstrous limb while being hauled screaming toward the water. Then the black sword slipped free from his grasp. It skidded spinning across the wet stones directly toward Aragorn as the half-orc vanished, shrieking into the black depths below. Water crashed high against the cavern walls. For a heartbeat, Aragorn saw enormous pale shapes writhing beneath the surface around the struggling orc. Then both monster and victim disappeared completely into darkness. Silence fell again across the cavern. Only the sheathed black sword remained lying upon the causeway between Aragorn and the dark water. The mountain trembled violently overhead once more, and somewhere deep within the tunnels came the distant roar of another massive collapse. Aragorn stared at the cursed blade, while cold water dripped steadily from the cavern roof around him. Then, slowly, the sword began sliding toward the lake entirely on its own. For a single heartbeat, Aragorn stood frozen, watching the black sword creep inch by inch across the wet stones as though drawn by an unseen hand beneath the water. No living thing touched it. Yet the blade moved steadily toward the edge of the causeway, its dark sheath leaving a thin trail through the grime and moisture. The lake beyond remained perfectly still once more, though Aragorn felt the presence waiting beneath its surface with terrible patience. A deep instinct warned him not to touch the weapon again. He had already felt the poison coiling within it, whispering against the mind like cold fingers searching for weakness. Yet if the sword vanished into the depths, some servant of darkness might one day recover it again. The thought hardened his resolve. He strode forward and seized the sheath just before it slipped into the black water. The effect was immediate. Pain shot through Aragorn's arm like ice driven beneath the skin, and the cavern around him seemed suddenly to darken. The whispers returned at once, louder and more desperate than before. He heard voices crying out across vast distances, the clash of armies, the weeping of women beside burning cities. Then another voice rose beneath them all, low and ancient, neither wholly male nor female, but vast and cold as winter beneath starless skies. "At last," it whispered. Aragorn clenched his jaw hard enough to ache and wrapped the sword tightly in his cloak to smother its influence. Even through the thick fabric, he could feel the thing pulsing faintly like a living heart. The mountain shuddered again above him, breaking the moment. Stones crashed into the lake nearby with violent splashes. Time was running out. The eastern tunnels remained open beyond the cavern, though dust now streamed constantly from cracks overhead. Aragorn moved quickly along the causeway, every sense strained for danger. The surviving Uruks had fled deeper into the mountain, abandoning their stolen weapons in terror after the half-orc's death. Aragorn passed one such sack spilled across the stones, where ancient swords and spearheads gleamed faintly in the gloom. He paused only long enough to kick them into the dark water below. Better they remain lost forever than arm the servants of Mordor. As he continued onward, the whispers from the wrapped black sword gnawed ceaselessly at the edges of his thoughts. At times he fancied he heard footsteps behind him where none walked. More than once he nearly turned, expecting to see pale eyes watching from the shadows. The tunnel climbed steeply now through rough, natural caverns, split by old cracks and underground streams. Aragorn's wounded leg burned fiercely with each step, and blood had begun soaking through the torn leather around his thigh. Exhaustion pressed heavily upon him after the long fighting below ground. Yet he forced himself onward through pain and darkness alike. Far behind him came another terrible roar as some deeper portion of the vaults collapsed entirely into ruin. A hot gust of dust-laden air rushed through the tunnels, carrying the smell of fire and shattered stone. The ancient armory was dying beneath the mountain. Soon little would remain of the pit, except buried ruins and darkness. At last, Aragorn glimpsed pale daylight ahead. The tunnel mouth opened high upon a steep mountainside, choked with wind-twisted pines and loose grey scree. Cold evening air struck his face sharply as he emerged from the depths, and for a moment he simply stood, breathing deeply beneath the open sky. The storm clouds had broken apart entirely now. Far to the west, the sinking sun burned red beneath ragged banks of cloud, staining the white mountains with bloody light. Aragorn looked back once toward the hidden valley below. Smoke billowed upward from the ruined tower, where fires still burned amid the collapsing camp. Portions of the cliffs themselves had fallen inward, burying sections of the ravine beneath tons of stone. No orc cries rose now from the valley. Whatever remained below was entombed forever. A voice called suddenly from among the rocks above. Aragorn wheeled instantly, with sword half drawn, before recognizing the Rohirrim rider he had freed earlier from the cages. The man limped down the slope toward him, accompanied by two other survivors carrying crude spears. All bore fresh wounds and exhaustion upon their faces, yet relief shone there also. "We feared you dead," the rider said breathlessly. Aragorn lowered his blade slowly. Many nearly were. He glanced past them. "The prisoners?" The rider nodded grimly. "Most escaped through the fissure before the mountain began falling. We lost some in the dark, but many yet live." Aragorn closed his eyes briefly in weary gratitude. Not all had been saved. There was never victory without loss. Yet enough had survived to matter. The young boy emerged then from behind the rocks carrying a waterskin. Dirt and dried blood streaked his face, but his eyes were steady now despite all he had seen. "Here," he said quietly, offering the skin to Aragorn. Aragorn drank deeply, washing dust and blood from his throat before returning it with thanks. The boy's gaze drifted toward the cloak-wrapped bundle beneath Aragorn's arm. "What is that?" he asked. Aragorn hesitated only briefly. Something that should never have been found. The Rohirrim rider frowned darkly at those words. Then cast it into the mountain and be rid of it. Aragorn looked toward the ruined valley below, where smoke drifted upward through the evening air. No, he said after a moment. Some evils buried carelessly are unearthed again. They descended the mountainside cautiously as darkness gathered over the hills. The surviving prisoners had made camp within a narrow sheltered hollow hidden among pines farther north of the ravine. Aragorn found nearly 30 souls there, huddled around small fires, while the wounded were tended with torn cloaks and crude bandages. Faces lifted hopefully as he entered the camp. Some stared openly in wonder, whispering among themselves of the lone ranger who had descended into the pit and returned alive. Aragorn ignored such looks. He had no desire for songs or praise. Too many had died beneath the mountain already. The young woman's brother from the village sat beside one of the fires with his arm bound tightly against his chest. When Aragorn approached, the man struggled painfully to his feet. "My sister," he said at once. "Is she safe?" Aragorn nodded. "She waits for you still." Relief broke across the young man's face so suddenly that Aragorn felt a faint warmth stir beneath his own weariness. Nearby, the old shepherd who had warned of the lower pit sat wrapped in blankets beside the fire, staring blankly into the flames. "I heard them below us for days," the old man muttered quietly as Aragorn passed. "Scratching in the dark water." Aragorn paused. Did the orcs feed the creature often? The shepherd shivered despite the fire's warmth. "Not always dead," he whispered. Aragorn said nothing further. Some memories were better left buried in silence. Night settled fully over the mountains. The stars emerged sharp and cold above the dark ridges, while small campfires flickered weakly among the trees. Aragorn sat apart from the others upon a flat stone overlooking the valley below. The wrapped black sword rested beside him. Even now he could feel its presence, seeping faintly through the cloak like winter cold through old walls. He dared not sleep while carrying it. Every so often the whispers returned softly at the edge of hearing. Promises, threats, fragments of old fears. Aragorn stared into the darkness beyond the fires and thought of Rivendell far to the north, where Elrond half-elven kept many hidden things from darker ages. Perhaps there, among the wise, this blade could finally be understood or destroyed. Soft footsteps approached behind him. The Rohirrim rider settled heavily upon a nearby stone with a tired groan. "The others sleep," the man said after a while. "Or try to." Aragorn nodded without turning. For several moments neither spoke. Then the rider glanced toward the cloak-wrapped sword. "That thing troubles you." Aragorn considered the firelit valley below before answering. Long ago, the servants of the enemy forged weapons not merely to kill the body, but to poison the heart. Some were lost after the last alliance of elves and men. Perhaps this is one. The rider spat into the dirt. Then it should be broken. Aragorn's gaze darkened slightly. Perhaps, but some blades do not break easily. A long silence followed, while the wind sighed softly through the pines around them. At last the rider spoke again, quieter this time. "You are no common wanderer, friend. I have seen captains of Gondor and marshals of the Mark. None carry themselves as you do." Aragorn almost smiled faintly at that. "Then you have looked too closely." The rider studied him for another moment before nodding slowly. "Perhaps. Still, whatever name you bear, tonight many live because of it." Aragorn didn't answer. Praise sat uneasily upon him, especially after bloodshed. He merely watched the distant ruins below, where faint embers still glowed beneath drifting smoke. Then, from somewhere deep beneath the buried mountain, a low horn sounded. The note rose faintly through the earth itself, so distant that at first Aragorn thought it merely wind among the rocks. Yet the sound came again, hollow, ancient. Answering something in darkness far below the collapsed vaults, Aragorn's eyes narrowed sharply. Beside him, the Rohirrim rider stiffened uneasily. "Did you hear that?" Aragorn rose slowly to his feet, staring toward the ruined valley where the mountain loomed black beneath the stars. The wrapped sword at his side suddenly grew cold as ice. And far below the earth, something moved. The horn did not sound again, yet its echo lingered unpleasantly in Aragorn's mind long after the mountainside fell silent once more. Around the camp, the freed prisoners stirred uneasily from troubled sleep, muttering to one another beside the fading fires. Some crossed themselves in old rustic ways against evil spirits, while others simply stared toward the ruined valley with hollow, fearful eyes. Aragorn remained standing upon the ridge, every sense sharpened toward the darkness below. The wrapped sword at his side pulsed faintly with cold, almost like a living thing answering a distant call. He did not believe in chance. Something beneath the mountain yet endured despite the collapse. Whether servant, spirit, or buried horror from elder days, he couldn't yet tell. The Rohirrim rider rose beside him, tightening his grip upon the borrowed spear. "If orcs still live below, we should quit this place before dawn," he said quietly. Aragorn nodded once, though his gaze remained fixed upon the valley. "You should," he answered. "Take the others north to the villages. Warn the king's riders what happened here." The man frowned immediately. "And you?" Aragorn rested one hand upon the cloak-wrapped sword. "I must make certain nothing follows us out of the mountain." The rider cursed softly beneath his breath. "You cannot fight the whole dark alone." Aragorn finally looked at him then, and there was weary truth in his grey eyes. "Most of my road has been walked that way already." Before dawn, the camp began breaking apart in silence. The wounded were placed upon rough litters fashioned from pine branches and cloaks, while the stronger survivors gathered what food and supplies they could salvage. Aragorn moved among them quietly, helping where needed without drawing attention to himself. The young woman's brother clasped Aragorn's forearm before departing. "My sister will remember your name," he said earnestly. Aragorn shook his head faintly. "Tell her only that the danger has passed." Yet even as he spoke the words, uncertainty gnawed at him. Had it truly passed? The horn beneath the mountain suggested otherwise. The young boy lingered near Aragorn while the others prepared to leave. In daylight he looked even younger, thin from hunger and exhaustion, beneath dirt-streaked hair. "You are going back," he said quietly, not as a question. Aragorn adjusted the straps, securing the wrapped sword across his back. "Only for a little while." The boy glanced toward the ruined valley, where pale mist drifted between broken rocks. "I heard things in the tunnels after we escaped," he whispered. "Voices speaking under the stone." Aragorn's expression remained calm, though the words troubled him. "The mountain makes strange echoes." The boy shook his head stubbornly. "Not echoes." Then, after a brief hesitation, he pulled something from beneath his ragged tunic. A small bronze token shaped like a 7-pointed star rested in his palm. "I found it near the lower pit." Aragorn took the token carefully. Ancient Númenórean markings circled its edges, almost worn smooth by time. Yet at the center, another symbol had been crudely carved later with harsh, angular lines. Aragorn recognized the mark at once, the lidless eye. His gaze hardened instantly. Someone had reached these vaults before the recent orc excavation. Someone serving Mordor had already searched the buried halls years ago and left signs behind. "Where exactly did you find this?" Aragorn asked sharply. The boy pointed toward the southern cliffs beyond the ruined tower, near a crack in the wall below the cages. "I thought it lucky." Aragorn closed his fingers slowly around the token. There were more tunnels beneath the mountain than he had seen. By sunrise, the survivors departed northward, through the hills under the Rohirrim riders' protection. Aragorn watched until the last of them vanished among the pines. Only then did he turn back toward the valley alone. Thin morning fog clung low across the shattered ravine, while smoke still drifted weakly from buried fires beneath the ruins. Ravens circled overhead in silence. The descent felt different now. The hidden valley that had once crawled with orcs and prisoners stood eerily empty beneath broken stone and collapsed earthworks. Burned tents sagged blackened against the mud. Corpses lay half-buried where the mountain had struck them down indiscriminately during the night. Aragorn moved cautiously among the ruins with sword drawn, listening for movement beneath the groaning stones. Near the shattered tower, he found it. A narrow crack split the earth where none had existed before, opened by the collapse deep below. Cold air drifted upward, carrying the same stale underground smell from the buried vaults. Aragorn knelt beside the opening and studied the darkness within. Fresh tracks marked the mud nearby. Not orc tracks, boots. Several individuals had climbed out during the night, while the survivors camped above unaware. Aragorn touched one print lightly. The edges remained sharp, recent. His jaw tightened. Somehow a few of the outlaws or Uruks had escaped the collapse after all. Worse, they had fled eastward into the hills, toward Mordor. Without hesitation, Aragorn descended into the crack. The passage sloped sharply downward through jagged stone where the collapse had ripped apart older tunnels hidden beneath the main vaults. Aragorn moved carefully, guided only by a small lantern whose dim light barely pierced the darkness ahead. Dust still hung thick in the stale air. More than once, he squeezed sideways through narrow gaps between fallen rocks, while loose earth trickled ominously around him. Yet the tracks remained visible. 3 survivors at most. One limped badly. Aragorn followed swiftly, despite exhaustion pulling heavily at his limbs. If word of the armory or the cursed sword reached Mordor, greater forces would soon descend upon these hills. The tunnel eventually opened into a low chamber, half flooded by black water. Here the tracks ended, beside a stone stair, descending deeper underground. Aragorn extinguished the lantern immediately upon seeing faint torchlight flickering below. Voices echoed upward through the stairwell, harsh whispers, afraid. He crept downward soundlessly until the lower chamber came into view, between cracked stones. 3 figures stood there exactly as he had guessed. 2 wounded outlaws and a surviving Uruk, crouched beside a crude fire, hastily built from broken beams. The Uruk's arm hung uselessly at its side, where a dead guardian's blade had nearly severed it. One outlaw stared nervously toward the tunnels, while the other clutched a small leather satchel against his chest. "We should keep moving," the first muttered. "The mountain groans like it wants us buried." The Uruk bared yellow fangs in irritation. "We move when I say." The second outlaw shook his head fearfully. "The master is dead. The other's gone. We have enough." He patted the satchel greedily. Coins clinked faintly inside. "The eye will reward us." Aragorn's gaze narrowed. They had stolen something more than mere gold. Before he could move, however, another sound drifted through the chamber. Soft scraping, slow, deliberate. The outlaw nearest the tunnel stiffened immediately. "Did you hear?" he began. Then pale shapes emerged silently from the darkness beyond the firelight. The dead guardians had followed. The outlaws screamed in panic. The Uruk seized its axe with a roar and charged blindly at the nearest dead warrior, but the ancient blade pierced straight through its chest before the creature even reached striking distance. One outlaw fled toward the stair, only to collide directly with Aragorn, emerging from the shadows above. The man recoiled in terror. "Help us!" he cried. Aragorn struck him hard across the jaw with the pommel of his sword, dropping him instantly. Behind them, battle erupted around the fire as the remaining outlaw shrieked and slashed wildly at the advancing dead. The guardians moved without haste or mercy. Their pale eyes burned coldly in the dark chamber. Aragorn seized the fallen satchel from beside the unconscious outlaw and retreated up the stair before the dead could turn toward him as well. He had no wish to test whether the guardians distinguished friend from foe anymore. The chamber below echoed with brief, terrible screams, followed by silence once more. Aragorn climbed rapidly through the collapsing tunnels until at last, pale daylight appeared ahead again. Only when he reached the surface did he open the satchel carefully upon a flat stone beside the ravine. Inside lay several silver coins bearing the kings of Gondor long dead, a small emerald brooch blackened with age, and one rolled parchment sealed in cracked wax. Aragorn unrolled it slowly. The parchment contained an old map of the White Mountain foothills, marked with faded Númenórean script. Most of the writing had become unreadable over time, yet one symbol stood out clearly near the ruined valley, a black circle drawn later in harsh ink. Beside it, someone had written 2 words in the common tongue. The Sleeping Gate. Aragorn stared at the map while cold wind stirred across the broken hills around him. Then he heard it again. Very faint now. Far below the mountain. A horn answering in darkness. The sound faded slowly beneath the earth until only the sighing wind remained among the broken stones. Aragorn stood alone upon the ridge above the ruined valley, with the ancient map spread open in his hands, while cold morning light crept across the mountains. Ravens circled low overhead, their harsh cries echoing among the cliffs like warnings spoken in some forgotten tongue. The words upon the parchment troubled him more deeply than the horn itself. The Sleeping Gate. Not a tomb, not merely an armory, hidden and sealed. A gate. Aragorn folded the map carefully and slipped it inside his cloak beside the bronze token marked with the lidless eye. Whatever slept beneath these mountains had drawn the servants of Mordor long before the recent digging began. The half-orc and his raiders had only clawed at the outer edges of something far older. He descended once more toward the shattered tower, moving cautiously through the wreckage while loose stones shifted beneath his boots. Smoke no longer rose from the buried vaults. The fires below had finally died, yet the valley still felt wrong, heavy with unseen watchfulness. Aragorn paused beside one of the collapsed cages where broken chains lay tangled among the mud and ash. Here men and women had waited in terror while darkness stirred beneath their feet. Rage flickered quietly within him at the memory. Such evils multiplied wherever the power of Mordor reached, feeding upon fear, greed, and despair. He had seen it in the north, in the wild lands east of Mirkwood, and now here upon the borders of Rohan. The shadows stretched farther every year. Near the base of the ruined tower, Aragorn found the stair descending underground, entirely buried beneath fallen rock. No passage remained visible now. The mountain had sealed its wound. He studied the rubble in silence for several moments, listening for any sign of movement below. Nothing answered. No horns, no whispers. Only deep stillness beneath countless tons of shattered stone. Yet the wrapped black sword resting across his back had grown colder since dawn. Aragorn could feel it clearly, even through the cloak binding it shut. The thing sensed something beneath the mountain. Perhaps it longed to return there. The thought unsettled him enough that he almost drew the blade and cast it into the buried depths, despite all caution. Instead, he climbed toward the southern cliffs, where the young boy had discovered the bronze token. There, half concealed beneath collapsed earth, Aragorn found traces of older stonework revealed by the night's destruction. Narrow black steps descended only a short distance before ending at a wall of solid rock. Yet the masonry was unmistakably ancient and far older than the ruined tower itself. Aragorn brushed dirt from the carved surface with gloved fingers. Worn symbols emerged slowly beneath the grime. Crowns, stars, a line of tall figures standing before a dark archway. At the center of the carving, a single warrior held aloft a long, narrow sword, very much like the cursed blade wrapped upon Aragorn's back. A chill passed through him despite the daylight. He knelt closer, studying the weathered carvings carefully. The figures surrounding the dark arch did not appear triumphant. They seemed fearful. Several turned their faces away, while others knelt with hands raised in warning. Aragorn traced one faded line of script beneath the image, though parts had crumbled away entirely. The remaining words were written in an old Númenórean form scarcely used even in Gondor now. Here the gate was shut against the nameless dark. Aragorn sat back slowly upon his heels. The dead guardians, the sealed armory, the cursed sword, all had served one purpose: containment. Long ago, men of Westernesse had imprisoned something beneath these mountains and hidden the means to open it among their war stores. Yet time had buried truth beneath legend until only fragments remained. The servants of Mordor had come searching blindly for weapons and treasure, never fully understanding what else slept below. Aragorn looked toward the shattered valley where the mountain now concealed its secrets once more. Had the collapse sealed the danger forever, or merely delayed it? A faint sound interrupted his thoughts. Hoofbeats. Aragorn rose instantly and slipped behind the broken stonework with hand upon sword hilt. Several riders approached along the ravine road below, carrying the green horse banner of Rohan. Their mail glimmered pale beneath the morning sun, and at their head rode a stern, grey-haired marshal with a spear resting across his saddle. The Rohirrim survivors had reached help sooner than expected. Aragorn watched silently as the riders spread through the ruined valley, studying the devastation with grim astonishment. One dismounted beside a dead orc, half buried beneath rubble, and muttered a curse. Another crossed himself uneasily upon glimpsing the shattered tower. At last, the marshal himself called upward toward the cliffs. "Come out, stranger. We know you are there." Aragorn considered briefly before stepping from concealment. The riders immediately lowered spears toward him out of habit, though the marshal raised one gloved hand to stay them. The older man studied Aragorn carefully from beneath heavy brows. "The survivors spoke true then," he said. "One man brought down this den." Aragorn glanced toward the buried ruins below. "The mountain aided me." A faint grim smile touched the marshal's weathered face at that. "Even so, my riders owe you a debt." His gaze settled upon the wrapped bundle across Aragorn's back. "What did they seek here?" Aragorn was silent for a moment. Then he answered carefully. Old weapons, forgotten things best left buried. The marshal nodded slowly, as though expecting no fuller explanation. Men who rode the borders of Rohan learned early that some dangers in Middle-earth ran deeper than ordinary wars. "Will more come?" he asked quietly. Aragorn looked eastward beyond the mountains, where unseen leagues away the shadow gathered strength in Mordor. "Yes," he said at last. "One day greater hosts than these." The wind stirred softly across the ravine. No rider spoke after that. Together they searched the ruins until midday, though little remained to uncover. Most tunnels had collapsed beyond recovery, sealing the deeper vaults forever beneath stone and darkness. The Rohirrim gathered their dead, while orc corpses were burned in great smoking heaps outside the valley. Aragorn said little during the work. His thoughts remained fixed upon the hidden carvings and the words upon the ancient map. The sleeping gate. Even entombed beneath the mountain, the mystery gnawed at him. He had seen enough of old evils awakening in forgotten places to know how fragile such seals could become with time. Before sunset, the marshal approached Aragorn beside the ravine entrance, where his horse waited, saddled for departure. "Ride with us to Edoras," the older man offered. "King Thengel should hear of this from your own mouth." Aragorn tightened the straps securing the wrapped sword behind his saddle. "Another time, perhaps." The marshal frowned slightly. "You travel east?" Aragorn nodded once. For a while. He could not yet bring the black sword to Rivendell. Too many roads lay between, and too many servants of the enemy already hunted these lands. First he needed answers. Somewhere in Gondor's old archives, or among the lore masters of the Dunedain, there might remain memory of the nameless dark sealed beneath the White Mountains long ago. The marshal studied him for another moment, before extending his forearm in warrior's farewell. Aragorn clasped it firmly. "Then may your road be guarded," the Rohirrim said. Aragorn almost smiled. "No road truly is." Then he mounted and turned his horse southward, along the narrowing trail beneath the mountains. Behind him, the riders of Rohan remained among the ruined valley, while smoke from the orc pyres drifted upward into the evening sky. Twilight settled slowly across the White Mountains as Aragorn rode alone through deepening shadow. The wind carried the scent of pine forests and distant snow from the high peaks above. Yet beneath those cleaner smells lingered another memory impossible to forget. Damp stone, blood, the black waters beneath the pit. More than once during the long ride, he felt the wrapped sword shifting faintly behind him, as though restless in its bindings. The whispers had grown quieter since morning, but they had not vanished entirely. Sometimes, just at the edge of hearing, he thought he caught fragments of words in forgotten tongues. Night finally covered the mountains beneath a cold scatter of stars. Aragorn made no fire when he stopped beside a narrow stream to rest his horse. Instead, he sat wakeful beneath an ancient pine, while darkness gathered thickly among the rocks around him. At length, he drew out the ancient map once more and studied the black mark beside the ruined valley. The sleeping gate. Then slowly, very carefully, Aragorn looked east. Far beyond sight, beyond leagues of wilderness and river and plain, lay Mordor beneath its clouded sky. He knew now with grim certainty that the shadow searched not only for kingdoms to conquer, but for older things hidden beneath Middle-earth since forgotten ages. Weapons, secrets, gates sealed by dead hands long ago. Aragorn folded the map again and closed his eyes briefly against the cold wind. Then, somewhere far behind him, beneath the buried mountain, a final horn answered through the earth before falling silent forever.
Друзі, це був Джон. І знаєте, після цієї історії у мене лишилося дивне відчуття тиші. Ніби після довгої дороги, коли нарешті зупиняєшся і починаєш чути власні думки. Мене зачепила одна проста річ. Темрява майже ніколи не приходить у світ із гучним грукотом. Часто вона починається з людської якоїсь там жадібності, страху, з бажання відкрити те, що краще було не чіпати. Водночас мені подобається думка, що справжня мудрість – це відсутність страху. Тобто, це не відсутність страху, це здатність дивитися на щось страшне і все одно не дозволити йому керувати собою. Я думаю, що в житті кожного є свої запечатані двері, речі, до яких небезпечно повертатися, спогади, спокуси, що тихо кличуть назад. І дуже важливо вчасно розуміти, що не кожна таємниця варта того, щоб її відкривати. Бо інколи найбільша сильна людина, найбільша сильніша людина не в тому, щоб знайти щось у темряві, а в тому, щоб мати мудрість залишитися. Це там назавжди. Дякую, що додивились відео. Всіх радий бачити. Тому до побачення, до наступних відео.